Hey everyone, I'm Liz and today I'm going to show you how I made these scaly mermaid tails out of crochet. This tutorial is part of a series where I show you how to make a complete crochet mermaid doll. In the first part, I showed you how to make the upper half of the body. If you missed that tutorial, click the link on the screen to find it because you'll need the upper body half to start your doll. Some other things you'll need for this tutorial are a crochet hook, I'll be using a size E, a pair of scissors, a yarn needle, and if you like, you could use a stitch marker or a bobby pin to keep track of the first stitch of your row. You'll also need some fiberfill, and of course you'll need yarn. For my doll's upper body, I used Cafe Latte from Red Heart brand, so I'm going to use the same color to make the arms. For the tail I used Panther Pink, also from Red Heart brand, for the foundation rows and for the scales. If you're using a thinner yarn for your scales, like Peyton's brand metallic yarns, you might want to use a different, thicker yarn for the foundation so that there aren't too many holes under the scales. If you're going to do that, make sure the color of your foundation rows matches the color you want the scales to be. But I'm going to use the same color yarn to make the foundation rows and the scales, since it's a thicker Aran weight yarn. And for the fins, I used Orchid from Red Heart. I'm using two different colors for the scales and fins, but if you like, you could use the same color for both. And of course, you don't have to use the same colors I'm using for any part of this doll. You can use any Aran or worsted weight yarn in any color you choose. And if you would like a written version of this doll, I've made a pattern available in my Ravelry store, which can be found in the description below, or you could click the link on the screen. I also used craft wire to make a wire skeleton for my doll. You don't need to make a skeleton for your doll, but if you want to make a doll with a neck, I highly recommend that you use something to reinforce the neck so that the head doesn't droop. You can find a link to my craft wire doll skeleton tutorial in the description below. In that tutorial I showed you how to make a regular doll skeleton. For this version, the only difference is that you make one long leg to be the tail of your doll. Before I start the lower half of the body, I need to make and attach the doll's arms to the armholes. I did the arms the same way I made them in part 2 of my realistic doll tutorial, so if you want to see in more detail how I did the arms, you can check out that video by clicking the link on the screen. I started the arms with a magic circle with 6 stitches of single crochet. Then I single crocheted for a couple of rows to make the hand. To create the wrist, I decreased 1 time per side for 1 row, and then increased 1 time per side for 1 row. To create the forearm, I single crocheted normally for 2 rows, then I did a row with just 1 increase. I repeated this twice to get the full length of the forearm. So I did 1 row with 1 increase between each 2 rows of normal single crochet, so that the arm got bigger little by little. I made the elbow the same way I made the wrist, by decreasing 1 time per side for 1 row, and then increasing 1 time per side for 1 row. And then to make the upper arm, I did it in the same way I did the forearm, with 2 normal rows of single crochet, and then 1 row with 1 increase. I repeated this 2 times again for the upper arm. And then I decreased 1 time per side for a row so that the top of the arm was about the same width as the armhole. And to finish the arm, I slip stitched to the first stitch and cut off a long tail of yarn to sew the arm to the armhole. I did this twice to create 2 identical arms. Now that the arms are sewn on, I'm just going to add a bit of fiberfill to the top of the body. Now I'm just going to begin right where I left off at the back of the work. I had just finished making the doll's stomach and hips. Next I'm going to create the foundation for the scales I'm going to make for the tail. First I'm going to end this color so I can start again with a new color, so I'm going to slip stitch into the first stitch of the row. And cut off my yarn to end the row. And I'm going to start again with another color. So I'm going to take my pink yarn, and I'm going to pull up a loop into the back loop of the middle back stitch at the bottom of the body. And I'm going to leave this front loop open. And then I'm going to chain 2. And that's going to count as my first stitch. Now before I continue, I need to figure out how many stitches I'm going to decrease by. If you don't want to do the math, you could just space 6 decreases throughout your row for this step if you don't mind it not being exact. But if you want, you could count your stitches and divide the total number of stitches by 6 and then subtract 1. And then decrease by that resulting number. If it doesn't divide evenly, don't worry about that, it won't really make a difference as long as you're decreasing 6 times. So since I have 20 stitches in my row, 20 divided by 6 is 3.3, minus 1 is 2.3, so I'm going to decrease every 2 stitches, and at the end of the row I'll have a couple of stitches left over, but once again it won't make a difference. So I'm going to single crochet into the back loops of each stitch, and I'm going to decrease every second stitch. I've already done the first stitch of the row, so I'm going to decrease the second. Since I'm working only in the back loops, for my decrease I'm going to thread my hook through the back loops of the next 2 stitches instead of the front loops. Pull up a loop, and single crochet to decrease. And I'm going to decrease that way for every second stitch of the row except at the end where I should have 2 stitches left over after my last decrease. I'm doing this first row of decrease to account for the bulk that my row of scales is going to add to the doll when I come back to work on these front loops. But if you'd rather make a doll with a larger, bulkier tail, you can skip this step. Alright, I finished my last decrease, so I'm just going to single crochet into these last 2 stitches. If you want to, you can add as many rows of single crochet as you like before we start to gradually decrease the doll if you want your doll to be thicker, but I'm not going to do that for this doll. Now I'm going to begin to gradually decrease the size of the doll's body. I'm going to do this in pretty much the same way I gradually slimmed the doll's waist in part 1, by adding 2 rows of normal single crochet between each row of decrease. First I'm going to single crochet for 2 rows, and once again I'm going to continue working in the back loops. And then I'm going to do one row with one decrease on each side of the body, so 2 decreases total. So now I'm going to do my 2 rows of regular single crochet between my rows of decrease. I'm going to go on repeating this pattern until I have a slightly smaller width than I want the knees to be, again to account for the size of the scales. So I'm going to repeat this 2 more times so that I'm doing 3 total rows of decrease. And don't forget to keep working in the back loops only. Alright, I've gotten to the end of my doll's knees. If you want to, you can add as many more rows of single crochet as you like before we start to gradually decrease the bottom of the doll again if you want your doll to be thicker, but I'm not going to do that for this doll. Now I'm going to add some fiberfill to the top of the tail. And now I'm going to slim the doll even more gradually to create the tip of the tail. I'm going to do pretty much the same thing I did for the upper part of the tail, except in my rows of decrease, I'm just going to do 1 decrease throughout the row instead of 2 decreases. So once again, I'm going to repeat 2 rows of regular single crochet, and 1 row with 1 decrease. And I'm going to repeat that 1 more time, so I'm going to do 2 total rows of decrease. Once again, I'm working only in the back loops. Alright, I've finished decreasing my work. Now I just want to make it a little longer, so that it's the same length as my doll's skeleton. So I'm just going to go on single crocheting for 8 more rows. But you can add as many rows as you like, or if your doll is already long enough, you can skip this step. Alright, I finished my 8 rows of single crochet and the doll is now the right length. Since my doll is already small enough to sew closed, I don't need to decrease to finish the doll. But if you made a bigger doll and the hole is still too big to sew closed, you should decrease 6 times per row, just like we did for the first row of the tail, until the hole gets small enough to sew closed. But for my doll, I'm just going to slip stitch to the first stitch of the row, and I'm going to cut off a long tail of my yarn. Before I sew the hole closed, I'm going to add some fiberfill to the tip of the tail. Next, I'm going to make the scales using the same color as my foundation rows. If you want, you could work the scales using a different similar color like I did with these metallic mermaid dolls. I did this because the metallic yarns are a bit thin, so if I used them to make the foundation rows, there would have been a lot of holes in the material. But for this doll, I'm just going to use the same color. I'm going to work my rows of scales onto these front loops of the foundation that I left out earlier. So I'm going to pull up a loop into the front loop here at the center back at the base of the doll's upper body. And then I'm going to chain 2. Next I'm going to double crochet into the next 3 loops. I'm making larger scales, but if you want to make a doll with smaller scales, just use single crochet instead of double crochet and work all 3 single crochets into the same loop. But I'm going to make large scales for my doll. If you're making an even bigger doll, you could use treble crochets instead of double crochets. So I've done my 3 double crochets. Next I'm going to slip stitch into the same loop that I just worked my last double crochet on. And then I'm going to slip stitch into the next loop. And I'm going to repeat that for every scale in this row, so once again I'm going to chain 2. Double crochet into the next 3 stitches. And then slip stitch back into the same stitch. And then slip stitch into the next stitch. Alright, I've finished with my first row of scales. Now for the rest of my scale rows, I'm going to do the same thing, except I'm going to leave out that extra slip stitch after making my scale. So I'm going to move aside my first row of scales, and I'm going to work into the next row of front loops. And I'm going to try to keep my scales lined up so that each scale is in between the 2 scales of the previous row. To do that, I'm going to make sure that I'm working the 3 double crochets of the scale in between the 2 scales from the previous row. So to do that, I'm going to slip stitch into the next front loops until I get to about the middle of the first scale of the previous row. And then I'm going to chain 2. and then double crochet into the next 3 loops. And then I'm going to slip stitch into the same loop. And since I'm skipping that slip stitch, I'm just going to go on to the next scale. So chain 2, double crochet 3, and slip stitch to the same stitch. And once again, chain 2, double crochet 3, and slip stitch to the same stitch. So I'm going to continue to add scales in a spiral all the way down to the bottom of the foundation. If you want, you could skip every other row of front loops to create less packed scales. For this doll, though, I'm not skipping any front loops. If you want to keep the scales properly lined up with the previous rows, work the double crochets into the same loop or add an extra slip stitch between scales every few rows, depending on where the scales are lining up. If the next 3 front loops are too far to the left to line up properly, work your double crochets into the same loop. If the next front loops are too far to the right to line up, add that extra slip stitch back in before making the next scale. And that's just going to even out the rows. Alright, I've gotten to the end of my rows of scales, so I'm just going to slip stitch to the last front loop of my foundation rows. And I'm going to cut off my yarn and sew in this end. Now I'm going to create the fins at the bottom of the tail using my light purple yarn. I'm going to pull up a loop where I want to start the fins at the bottom of the tail. So I'm going to move aside these scales and I'm going to pull up a loop into the stitches of my foundation row. I'm going to start on the right side of the doll about 2 inches from the middle with my doll facing me. Where you start really depends on how wide you want the doll's fins to be and how large you made your doll. So I'm going to chain 2. And that chain is going to count as my first stitch, so I'm going to mark it with my stitch marker. Then I'm going to double crochet through the scales around the tip of the tail to make the foundation for my doll's fins. I'm going to double crochet 3 more times on this right side, then double crochet once in the middle, and then double crochet 4 more times on the left side to create a total of 9 foundation stitches. Next I'm going to mark the middle stitch with another bobby pin. And then I'm going to turn the work and chain 17. You could chain more or less if you want your doll's fins to be longer or shorter. Just chain until you have the length that you like. Now that I have my chain of 17, I'm going to slip stitch into the second chain for my hook. And then slip stitch again into the next chain. Then I'm going to half double crochet into the rest of my chains until I get back to the bottom. So to half double crochet, I'm going to yarn over, pull up a loop in the next chain, and then pull a loop through all the loops on my hook. So I'm going to half double crochet into the rest of the chains of my row. Alright, now I'm back at the bottom and I have 14 half double crochets complete. So now I'm going to slip stitch into the next double crochet stitch at the bottom from the stitch where I chained, which is the 8th stitch of my foundation row. So now I'm going to chain 1 and turn my work, and I'm going to half double crochet into the half double crochets from the previous row, but I'm only going to work my stitches into the middle loop of the half double crochet. And I'm going to leave the front loop and the back loop facing the outside of the work. So in this row, I'm going to half double crochet into each stitch except for the last 2 half double crochets of the row. Since I had 14 half doubles in the previous row, this is going to give me a total of 12 half double crochets before my last 2. And then when I get to those last 2 half doubles, I'm going to decrease the last 2 half double crochet stitches together. To do that, I'm going to yarn over, and then I'm going to thread my hook through the middle loop of those last 2 stitches, pull up a loop, and half double crochet to decrease. Now I'm going to chain 1 to start my next row back to the bottom, and that's going to count as the first stitch. Then I'm going to half double crochet into those middle loops of the half double crochets I just made, starting from the second stitch. So I've reached the bottom again. I did 12 more half double crochets in this row. Now I'm going to slip stitch into the next double crochet at the bottom of the tail. And then chain 1, turn, and once again half double crochet into the middle loops until I just have 2 stitches left in the row. That's going to be 10 half double crochets. Okay, I finished 10 half double crochets, and now I'm on the last 2 stitches of the row, so once again I'm going to decrease those 2 stitches together. And then chain 1 for the first stitch, turn the work, and half double crochet into those middle loops until the bottom. So I've reached the bottom again after doing 10 more half doubles. Now I'm going to slip stitch into the next double crochet at the bottom of the tail. Then chain 1, and continue to make half doubles into those 2 middle loops except for the last 2. And I'm going to keep repeating that pattern until I reach the middle double crochet stitch that I marked at the bottom of the tail. So this is going to be my last row. This time I have a total of 8 half doubles before my decrease. Then I'm going to chain 1 for the next row, and half double crochet until I get to the bottom again. Now I've done my last 8 half double crochets, and here at the bottom I'm going to slip stitch one more time into the marked middle stitch at the bottom of the tail. And then I'm going to cut off my yarn and sew in this end. And now to make the next fin, I'm just going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to pull up a loop in that marked chain 2 that counted as the first stitch at the bottom of the tail. Then I'm going to chain 17. And then I'm going to repeat the same process as the first fin to make a fin of the exact same size. So now I've finished my second fin, so now I'm going to slip stitch into the same marked middle stitch where I ended the other fin. And then I'm going to cut off my yarn and sew in my end. So I finished making the other fin, and now the mermaid's body is complete. If you missed the first part of this tutorial, you can find it by clicking the link on the screen, or you can find it in the description below. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, give it a like or share it on social media. You can also find the written pattern in my Ravelry store. The link is in the description below. If you want to add hair to your doll, you could also check out my doll hair tutorials. The link will be at the end of this video. You can also find my sea stars tutorial, which is what I'll be using to clothe my doll. Or again, look in the description. If you want to support me in making new videos, consider donating to my Patreon page. It's entirely optional, but if you do, you can get some perks like having access to my videos a week before they're posted here on YouTube. You can find more about that in the description below. And if you want to see more videos like this in the future, subscribe to my channel and I'll see you all next time. Bye!